Welcome to this historical journey, one that delves into an exceptionally unsettling episode within the annals of Louisiana's past. Before we begin, I encourage you to share your location and the current time in the comments below. We are intrigued to discover the reach of these documented narratives, spanning various places and hours of the day or night. The official records housed within the St. Martin Parish courthouse reveal a peculiar blank space, an unexplained lacuna stretching from the spring of 1843 until the late summer of 1845. For many decades, this void was casually attributed to the ravages of swamp humidity or simply the disorganized state of record-keeping common in pre-Civil War Louisiana. However, a significant discovery was made in 1962. During a planned refurbishment of the courthouse basement, construction workers uncovered a small, metallic box securely sealed behind a section of brickwork that noticeably contrasted with its older surroundings. Inside lay a collection of meticulously handwritten accounts, official legal papers, and a thick, leather-bound diary whose cover bore dark, absorbed stains around the periphery. The parish clerk who first examined this strange collection immediately requested that the papers be resealed and stored entirely separately from all public documents. They remained undisturbed until 1965. It was then that Professor James Whitmore from Tulane University secured temporary permission to access them for what he termed historical cataloging and documentation. Intriguingly, these documents were never subsequently released for public review. In 1968, a relatively minor fire reportedly broke out in the archive's supplemental storage area. Official reports concluded that several cartons of historical materials were tragically destroyed, including specifically this recovered collection. Despite this alleged loss, Professor Whitmore's extensive and detailed notes survived. His writings lay out the harrowing account of the person local inhabitants once referred to as the Bayou bride, a narrative that appears to have been intentionally expunged from all formal history. The unfolding tragedy begins with a single name, Meline. Analysis of the 1900 census, listing the most common female names in Louisiana, indicates Meline held the 27th position in local popularity. In the early months of 1843, Meline Reynolds arrived in the town of St. Martinville, a prosperous but small community situated along the Bayou, approximately 15 miles distant from the settlement of New Iberia. Her arrival marked her new status as the wife of Harold Walker, the proprietor of the Oak Shadow Plantation, an operation known as one of the largest and most intensive sugarcane producers in the parish. Harold Walker was a man of 47, having been widowed for the preceding 3 years. His first wife, Caroline, had passed away from what the attending local physician had formally diagnosed as excessive melancholy leading to a physical decline, a frequent diagnosis for what is today recognized as severe clinical depression. Walker had traveled 4 months earlier to Charleston, South Carolina, and returned with his new bride, a woman barely half his age. From all available evidence, including surviving correspondence and sparse diary entries from the wives of neighboring planters, Meline was described as exceptionally beautiful, possessing an unerringly intense, assessing quality to her gaze. She was clearly well-educated, articulate, and seemed to adapt with remarkable speed to her new responsibilities as the mistress of the Oak Shadow estate, despite having no prior background in managing a household of its immense scale. The Oak Shadow Plantation utilized the labor of 48 enslaved individuals, an unusually high number for an estate of its physical size. Period tax records suggest that Harold Walker had a local reputation for purchasing problematic labor, often acquiring enslaved people with known histories of attempted flight or open resistance at drastically reduced prices. A letter dated April 7, 1843, penned by Margaret Beauchamp, the wife of an adjacent planter, to her sister in Baton Rouge, remarked, "The recently arrived Mrs. Walker has embraced her household duties with an unsettling fervor." Harold seems completely satisfied with his choice, though I must admit there is an element in her composure that makes one feel subjected to scrutiny rather than engaging in simple conversation. She asks particular questions that polite ladies rarely concern themselves with, regarding the daily control of the field gangs and the details of various disciplinary actions. The plantation's head overseer, a man named Thomas Hebert, had been employed at Oak Shadow for a solid 11 years. According to later sworn statements given to the parish sheriff, Hebert found Meline's intense curiosity concerning plantation logistics quite unbefitting for a woman of her social standing. Despite his discomfort, Harold firmly directed Hebert to fully answer any and all inquiries his new wife might have. During her initial weeks on the property, Meline was frequently seen spending long hours inspecting the grounds. She exhibited a peculiar fascination with the far eastern boundary, the area where the orderly rows of cultivated cane fields abruptly surrendered to the dense, murky cypress swamp. This tract of land, known locally by the evocative French phrase la fin de terre, or the earth's end, was considered worthless and unusable, marking the plantation's terminal boundary before it dissolved entirely into the Bayou's stagnant waters. The first incident noted as out of the ordinary occurred approximately 6 weeks following Meline's arrival. Ruth, an enslaved woman who worked within the main house, reported to Overseer Hebert that several items were missing from the kitchen stores. She specifically mentioned a large, heavy butcher's cleaver, lengths of rope, and an entire bottle of the laudanum that Harold typically consumed to alleviate his chronic gout pain. Hebert later noted in his personal diary that when he mentioned the missing items to Meline, she appeared entirely unconcerned, coolly suggesting that a junior house servant had perhaps misplaced them during routine cleaning. No thorough investigation was ever initiated, and the matter was seemingly forgotten by Meline. In the early days of May 1843, a field hand identified as Solomon was reported absent. Solomon had been acquired by Walker only the previous year and had already made 2 unsuccessful attempts to flee. His non-appearance was not initially viewed as unusual, and Walker immediately issued the standard orders, a search of neighboring properties, and the posting of a $20 reward for his capture and return. After 3 days passed without a sighting, Hebert organized a more systematic search utilizing specialized tracking hounds. The dogs followed Solomon's scent trail directly to the edge of the dense swamp, but at that boundary, they suddenly and violently refused to enter, becoming extremely agitated and uncontrollable. This behavior was considered deeply strange, as these same trained animals had a proven history of tracking runaway slaves deep into the most difficult swamp terrain on previous occasions. Harold Walker, as documented in Hebert's journal, was mentally prepared to accept the loss and proceed with filing an insurance claim for the escaped property. It was Meline who, surprisingly, insisted that the search efforts be extended. In what was described as a striking exhibition of feminine resolve, she personally offered an additional $30, drawn from her own wedding dowry funds, to anyone who could either locate Solomon or supply concrete information regarding his fate. The reward remained unclaimed. Solomon was never seen again. 3 weeks later, a second disappearance took place. This time, the missing person was Mary, a domestic servant assigned to Meline's personal service. According to the statements provided by the kitchen staff, Mary had been summoned to Meline's private sitting room the evening before her absence was noted. No one claimed to have witnessed her leaving the main residence afterward. Unlike the case of Solomon, Mary had absolutely no record of attempting escape. She was a native of the plantation and had numerous family ties within the enslaved community, including her mother, 2 sisters, and a small son aged 4. When questioned by Hebert, Meline claimed she had dismissed Mary early, stating she was suffering from a headache and wished for solitude. She expressed profound surprise at the woman's sudden vanishing, theorizing that perhaps Solomon had indeed returned and successfully persuaded Mary to run away with him. The search conducted for Mary was noticeably less thorough than the one mounted for Solomon. Lacking any history of flight, she was initially presumed to be merely hiding somewhere on the property, possibly terrified of punishment for some minor, unknown misstep. After 5 days had elapsed, Harold Walker formally closed the case, assigning another house servant, Esther, to take Mary's place in attending to Meline's needs. It was during this period that the first accounts of unusual, unsettling vocalizations emanating from the swamp began to circulate among the enslaved population. Several field hands insisted they had heard distinct female cries carrying from deep within the cypress trees long after the sun had set. Overseer Hebert summarily dismissed these accounts as mere superstition, noting in his journal entry that the Negroes have been thrown into an excessive state of agitation by these recent vanishings, and are now projecting their fears onto every natural sound of the bayou at night. By the middle of June, the atmosphere pervading Oak Shadow had changed quite noticeably, according to correspondence from the owners of surrounding plantations. The field workers moved and labored in an unsettling silence, and ironically, productivity had actually increased despite the oppressive summer humidity. Hebert noted with self-satisfaction that incidents requiring punishment had been cut by almost 50%. When Harold's brother, William Walker, traveled from New Orleans to visit in late June, he commented in a letter to one of his business partners that Harold's new wife has introduced a striking level of discipline to the entire operation. The Negroes appear positively terrified of displeasing her, although I personally observed her utilizing no exceptional methods of correction. William also mentioned that his brother Harold seemed notably subdued since his marriage, describing him as quieter than I recall, and apparently content to yield to Meline's judgment on matters I would have expected him to control with firmness. He observed that Harold had developed a persistent hacking cough and had lost a significant amount of weight, symptoms Meline calmly attributed to the combination of summer humidity aggravating his delicate constitution. On July 2, 1843, a field hand named Isaac was absent from the morning roll call. Isaac was documented in the plantation logs as a reliable if strong-willed worker who had been at Oak Shadow for 7 years. His disappearance represented the third such case in a span of less than 3 months. This time, Harold Walker ordered only a cursory inspection of the immediate grounds before officially declaring Isaac a runaway. According to Hebert's journal, Meline displayed minimal concern regarding this latest disappearance, merely remarking that the oppressive heat and heavy work occasionally drive certain men to make poor decisions. What transpired next is documented within the most chilling section of the recovered archives. Several pages extracted from Meline's private diary, which apparently commenced soon after her arrival at Oak Shadow. The script is remarkably neat, almost mathematical in its precise formation, utterly lacking the decorative flourishes typical of female handwriting of that era. The diary entry dated July 7th is a chilling read. Harold continues to lose strength, despite the daily tonic I prepare. He questioned me about the faint noises that drifted from the eastern marsh last night. I assured him it was merely the alligators during their seasonal mating period. He seemed unconvinced, yet too physically drained to press the matter further. The specialized tincture I am now adding to his nightly brandy ensures that he sleeps deeply enough so as not to be disturbed when I attend to my necessary night work. The last one was exceptionally challenging, far stronger than I had calculated. I must exercise greater care in my selection process next time. By the midpoint of July, reports of the unusual noises from the swamp had grown frequent enough that even neighboring estates were taking notice. Margaret Beauchamp, in a subsequent letter to her cousin Elizabeth Carmel, whose family owned property adjoining Oak Shadow's eastern line, detailed the utterly unsettling howls that carry across the water after midnight. The sounds are so terrifying that our own dogs join in the clamor and cannot be silenced. Our overseer insists it is simply a large heron or possibly a panther. But I have resided near this swamp my entire life and never once heard anything comparable. On July 23rd, Harold Walker was confined to his bed, suffering from what was described as a rapid wasting fever. Dr. Samuel Wilson, the local physician, was called to examine him. Dr. Wilson's case notes, which were included in the rediscovered documents, indicate that he suspected pulmonary consumption, noting the patient's severe, unexpected weight loss, the constant hacking cough, and the occasional presence of blood within the sputum. He prescribed complete rest, a diet of beef broth, and a standard dosage of laudanum for both pain management and sleep. What Dr. Wilson found far more remarkable, however, was Meline's icy conduct. In a confidential letter dispatched to a professional medical colleague in New Orleans, Wilson wrote, "The newly arrived Mrs. Walker exhibits none of the expected distress one would anticipate from a bride of scarcely 4 months, whose husband faces a potentially terminal illness. She receives all my medical instructions with utter, perfect composure and insists on personally administering his medicines, consistently declining the help of the house servants. The most singular moment was her peculiar inquiry. She asked whether, in my professional experience, a human body interred in the murky water of a swamp would decompose at a faster rate than one buried in dry ground. She claimed the question stemmed from a novel she was reading, but I must confess the nature of the query left me profoundly uneasy. Throughout the duration of Harold's illness, no additional vanishings were reported among the enslaved community. Overseer Hebert observed that the field work continued with unnatural efficiency, and the enslaved people now noticeably operated in small, cohesive groups, never allowing any individual to be isolated, especially during the evening hours or when working closer to the defined boundary of the swamp. By the start of August, Harold's physical condition had significantly worsened. Dr. Wilson visited every third day, but his medical notes suggest he held very little hope for recovery, writing on August 9th that the patient's physical decline is accelerating far beyond any reasonable expectation. Mrs. Walker reports diligently administering the prescribed treatments, yet I witness absolutely no improvement. Indeed, quite the reverse appears to be true. On August 15th, 1843, Harold Walker passed away in his bed at Oak Shadow Plantation. The official cause of death was recorded as consumption, although Dr. Wilson privately harbored serious reservations concerning the uncommonly rapid progression of the illness. Meline organized a simple funeral service, citing her late husband's supposed preference for modesty, and Harold was interred in the small Walker family plot on the plantation grounds. With Harold's passing, Meline inherited complete legal ownership and control of the Oak Shadow estate. The couple had produced no children, and Harold had no surviving male relatives residing in Louisiana who might challenge the will. His brother, William, who represented the only potential challenger, had returned to New Orleans and, according to documented correspondence, had himself succumbed to what was described as a similar wasting ailment shortly after his visit to Oak Shadow. It was immediately following Harold's burial that the most horrifying sequence of disappearances commenced. Between the late days of August and the early part of October of 1843, an additional 5 enslaved individuals vanished from Oak Shadow. Unlike the initial cases, none of these individuals possessed any history of attempted escape. The missing included a very elderly man who had worked on the plantation for over 2 decades, a woman in the advanced stages of pregnancy, just weeks from her delivery date, and a 14-year-old boy who was assigned to the stable duties. Overseer Hebert's journal entries from this period reveal his mounting apprehension, not only regarding the accelerating disappearances, but also Meline's increasingly peculiar methods of management. He wrote on September 12th, "Mrs. Walker now insists on personally selecting the hands who will labor in the eastern fields each day, a responsibility that has always fallen under my own judgment. Her choices appear to follow no rational pattern I can discern, sometimes selecting the strongest workers, other times picking out those who have demonstrated only the slightest infractions in their duties. Those selected for this special assignment frequently return from their day's labor with a disturbing, deep quietness about them. I have observed that within a single week of such a selection, they almost invariably disappear. By October, the alarming rumors had begun to spread far beyond the boundaries of Oak Shadow. James Collins, the parish sheriff, received a completely anonymous letter strongly asserting that the most vile murder is occurring at the Walker plantation. The enslaved are being mercilessly slaughtered by the mistress's own hand and callously consigned to feed the beasts of the swamp. Sheriff Collins initially dismissed the letter as malicious gossip, likely fabricated by a disgruntled business competitor of the late Harold Walker. However, he did undertake an unannounced inspection of Oak Shadow on October 10th. Sheriff Collins's official report, which was among the recovered documents, states that he discovered no evidence of unusual activity at the plantation. He described Meline as a perfectly gracious widow, managing her property admirably under trying circumstances. He noted that she provided him with a complete tour of the estate, including the slave quarters, where he was free to engage in conversation with any of the workers. He did make the passing observation that the Negroes seemed excessively subdued, though they appeared adequately fed and exhibited no visible marks of physical mistreatment. Crucially, what Collins omitted from his official statement, but revealed in a private letter to Judge Martin Voorhees, was that he intentionally declined Meline's pressing invitation to inspect the remote eastern boundary of the property, citing severe time constraints. He confessed to the judge that there was something in the lady's overly eager suggestion that we walk to the edge of the swamp that instilled in me a profound and inexplicable reluctance to proceed. I cannot articulate the precise nature of the sentiment, except to state that as we stood upon the veranda, gazing toward that distant cypress line, I had the chilling sensation of being measured for a purpose entirely unrelated to my official duties. The day immediately following Sheriff Collins's inspection, an enslaved man named Daniel vanished. Daniel was one of the individuals the sheriff had spoken with during his tour. According to later accounts gathered by Overseer Hebert from other enslaved people, Daniel had assured the sheriff that working conditions at Oak Shadow were as good as could be expected. But he had then added a deeply unsettling remark. Those some who go to work by the East Marsh never return to tell what they've seen. 2 days after the disappearance of the enslaved man Daniel, the overseer Thomas Hebert himself vanished, without a trace. This absence created immediate and profound alarm, as it defied any easy explanation involving escape or typical plantation insubordination. Hebert was a free white man, a recognized figure of stability within the St. Martin community, with established family and social ties in nearby New Iberia. His absence became official when he failed to appear at a crucial scheduled meeting with cotton factors in St. Martinville on October 14th. When quickly assembled groups of concerned neighboring planters and a hastily formed search party arrived at Oak Shadow, Meline Walker calmly met them. She claimed that Hebert had abruptly tendered his resignation following a severe disagreement regarding the efficient management and discipline of the plantation labor. She then produced a letter ostensibly authored by Hebert, which stated his unequivocal intention to immediately depart Louisiana and seek new employment opportunities in Mississippi. The script and signature on this document were later privately questioned by Hebert's brother, who noted subtle but significant variations in the handwriting, though no formal, official investigation was pursued into the letter's authenticity at that time. The search party, now directed by Frederick Beauchamp from the adjacent Beauchamp estate, insisted on conducting a thorough methodical examination of the entire Oak Shadow property, including all slave quarters, storage sheds, and outbuildings. They reported finding nothing demonstrably unusual or incriminating. Yet several members noted the extreme and unsettling reluctance of the enslaved populace to communicate with them, even during moments when Meline was demonstrably absent from the vicinity. Beauchamp later transmitted his grave concerns in a formal dispatch to Sheriff Collins. He wrote, "The entirety of the plantation appears to be operating beneath a palpable blanket of silence, a phenomenon I have never before witnessed in this district. The field workers perform their duties with their eyes fixed firmly on the ground, exchanging not a single word even amongst themselves. Most profoundly disturbing was our approach to the eastern property line, where the cultivated land meets the cypress swamp. As our group drew closer to that specific line, our enslaved guides became so emotionally and physically distressed that 2 women spontaneously fell to their knees, refusing point blank to advance another step. When urgently pressed for a coherent explanation, they would only repeat the same chilling phrase. That's where the mistress takes them." The planters' search party ultimately did not venture into the swamp itself. Dusk was rapidly approaching, and none of the men possessed sufficient, intimate knowledge of that particular section of the Bayou Teche territory to risk navigating its treacherous landscape after nightfall. They unanimously agreed to regroup and return with necessary equipment the following morning, bringing boats and additional experienced hands. That night, according to multiple sworn statements later collected by authorities, numerous unusual lights were sighted, reportedly moving deep within the swamp area. Furthermore, the strange sounds, described variously as high-pitched wailing, guttural screaming, and most bizarrely, a woman singing in a haunting, unfamiliar tongue, were clearly heard by inhabitants on neighboring plantations as far as 2 miles away from Oak Shadow. The following morning, when Beauchamp returned to Oak Shadow Plantation with a significantly larger party, including several highly experienced local swamp guides, they were met by a scene of utter bizarre emptiness. The main house stood with its front doors wide open. No domestic servants were tending to the grounds. Crucially, the field hands were absent from their usual morning stations. The entire remaining enslaved population of Oak Shadow Plantation, at that point documented as 39 individuals, was gone. The search party proceeded with extreme caution through the now abandoned estate. Inside the main house, they discovered clear evidence of extremely hasty departure and frantic packing. Dresser drawers were pulled open and emptied, and certain high-value, portable possessions were missing. However, a far more significant discovery was made in Meline's private sitting room. The searchers uncovered a hidden compartment concealed beneath a loose floorboard. Inside lay a small, thick, leather-bound book, several unusual, crude implements described as being of foreign or African design, and a disturbing collection of small cloth pouches containing what were later identified as human teeth, hair, and bone fragments. The small leather journal, which came to constitute the most significant portion of the recovered archival documents, finally began to reveal the true, systemic horror of what had transpired at Oak Shadow. Written in the same precise architectural script as the earlier entries, but now filling page after page with increasingly deranged and disturbed content. Meline's writings detailed a meticulously calculated campaign of ritual murder. She meticulously described selecting her victims with extreme care, spending days observing them for any signs of notable physical strength or inherent spiritual resilience. She wrote of successfully luring them to the swamp's immediate edge under various deceitful pretexts, usually a supposed special private assignment from a mistress that could not be refused, and then forcibly subduing them with water heavily laced with drugs, or, in the cases of the larger, stronger men, having them brutally struck from behind with a custom-weighted club as they performed their assigned duties. The most profoundly disturbing passages detailed what she referred to simply as the feeding. These were elaborate ritualized actions conducted within a small, hidden clearing situated deep within the swamp's confines, a place accessible only via a narrow, twisting trail that Meline herself had discovered and subsequently widened during her initial, long explorations of the property. Here, according to her maniacal writings, she would bring her often still living victims and perform a calculated series of ritualistic cuts, slowly allowing their blood to drain into the dark, stagnant water below while reciting what she called the old words my grandmother taught me in Charleston. Meline claimed in these later writings that her grandmother had been forcibly brought to South Carolina from Haiti during the height of the revolution there, and had covertly passed down secret knowledge concerning the control of spirits and the unnatural binding of human will. She chillingly wrote that each subsequent feeding ritual made her own personal essence stronger, while simultaneously achieving the desired effect of weakening the will of those who remained enslaved at Oak Shadow, rendering them increasingly compliant and psychologically less likely to attempt flight or resistance. The journal's final brief entry, dated October 15, 1843, the day immediately following Hebert's disappearance, reads, "They know now. I clearly saw it in Beauchamp's eyes today, that subtle flicker of understanding beneath his feigned performance of neighborly concern. The swamp itself has whispered to them. Or perhaps Hebert did not succumb as quickly as the others. No matter, I have taken sufficient essence to successfully complete what I began. Harold is brother, 9 of the strongest among the slaves. Their stolen essence now courses through my veins. Tonight I will issue the final call to the remainder at the water's edge. Those who are truly worthy will be transformed into my lasting instruments." The rest will feed what thrives beneath the cypress roots. By the first light of dawn, we will have departed this region, moving swiftly westward along the hidden water paths where white men instinctively fear to venture. In the vast territories of the West, we will locate another suitable plantation, another master desperately in need of a wife, and we will begin the cycle anew. The search party, upon urgently reading selected portions of this deeply disturbing journal, immediately organized a much larger, fully armed expedition to penetrate the critical swamp area at the eastern extremity of Oak Shadow. Local seasoned guides and experienced hunters led them through the extremely challenging terrain, meticulously following what appeared to be a recently used, slightly widened trail. After nearly 2 hours of painstaking progress through the dense cypress growths and knee-deep standing water, they eventually reached a small, remote island of relatively dry land. What they found there was subsequently detailed in a solemn sworn statement by Frederick Beauchamp, which stands as the only written account of the macabre discovery to have survived. The clearing provided unmistakable evidence of repeated, horrific activities. A large, ancient cypress tree situated at the island's center had been permanently altered, with numerous iron spikes and hooks crudely driven into its trunk at varying heights. The ground beneath this tree was widely and deeply stained dark in a wide circle. Personal effects, a tattered shoe, small fragments of cloth, a distinctively carved wooden pendant known to have belonged to the missing house servant Mary, were discovered scattered around the perimeter of the clearing. The most profoundly disturbing discovery was a large object, partially submerged within a pool of stagnant water, which the local guides immediately identified as a gree-gree of tremendous size. A ritualistic object consisting of a crude burlap sack containing various items. When forced open and examined, this sack was found to hold human remains, specifically severed human hands, at least a dozen by their hurried count, all in varying stages of decomposition. Among them, positively identified by a distinctive gold ring still clasped tightly on one finger, were the remains of Thomas Hebert. The organized search continued relentlessly for 3 more days, expanding outward from this grisly clearing. But absolutely no further sign of Meline or any of the 39 missing enslaved people was ever located. The prevailing hypothesis, officially recorded in Sheriff Collins's final report, was that Meline had successfully led her followers westward through the complex, interconnected waterways, presumably heading toward the far, less settled territories of Texas. A formal warrant for Meline Walker's arrest on charges of multiple murders was immediately issued, but she was never apprehended. Reports of similar, isolated disappearances and strange, unsettling occurrences surfaced sporadically over the ensuing decade in western Louisiana and eastern Texas, but none could ever be definitively and formally linked to her. Oak Shadow Plantation was eventually sold at a public auction to cover the late Harold Walker's numerous outstanding debts, as his estate had been severely and deliberately mismanaged in the months leading up to his death. The new owners of the property reportedly refused to clear or cultivate the entire eastern section bordering the swamp, leaving it to naturally revert to wilderness. In 1862, during the Civil War, the main house of Oak Shadow was deliberately set ablaze by retreating Confederate forces to prevent its potential use as a headquarters by the advancing Union Army. The property was subsequently broken up and sold to multiple new owners after the conclusion of the war, and the ominous name Oak Shadow was deliberately and permanently retired from use. Local parish histories of St. Martin written during the late 19th century make absolutely no mention of the Walker case or the extensive disappearances at Oak Shadow. It was as if the entire horrific incident had been successfully expunged from the collective community memory. Professor Whitmore's personal notes from his 1965 examination of the hidden documents conclude with a disturbing postscript. During the course of his research, he attempted to genealogically trace the descendants of the principal families mentioned in the case, the Walkers, the Heberts, and others. While painstakingly tracking these various genealogical lines, he uncovered an unusual and recurrent pattern. In the decades immediately following the Oak Shadow tragedy, An unusually high number of socially prominent men in the region died from what was frequently described as wasting illnesses, symptoms strikingly similar to those of Harold Walker. More striking still was the fact that many of these men had, shortly prior to their rapid decline, married women with extremely limited or completely unverifiable backgrounds. These marriages were typically very brief, with the husband rarely surviving more than a single year, and the widows tended to immediately vacate the area soon after successfully settling their substantial inheritance claims. Whitmore's final note, chronicling his research in various parish records, reads, "While methodically investigating these patterns in Natchitoches parish records, I encountered a routine request for marriage documentation submitted by a woman seeking to prove her great-grandmother's union to a plantation owner in 1857. The woman provided her ancestors' daguerreotype, hoping it might assist in locating relevant records. The faded image, though blurred, shows a woman with a striking intensity to her gaze that I found immediately familiar from descriptions contained within the recovered Walker documents. Most disturbing, however, was the name provided for the ancestor, Melanie Bear. She should have been 60 or 70 years old by then, yet the woman captured in the image appears to be no older than 30. I have not shared this unsettling discovery with the woman who provided the portrait, who currently resides in East Texas. I have, however, noted that her family has seemingly prospered unusually well over generations, despite their reported origin with severely limited initial resources. The archival fire that allegedly destroyed the original Walker documents occurred 3 months after Whitmore had finally completed his intensive examination. Whitmore himself died less than a year later from what his attending physician described as rapid onset consumption. The very same diagnosis given to Harold Walker 125 years earlier. To this very day, local inhabitants living near the former Oak Shadow property continue to report hearing unusual sounds emanating from the deep cypress swamp at night. What some describe as a woman singing in a language that causes the skin to crawl. Fishermen deliberately avoid certain winding passages of Bayou, claiming the water in those areas feels wrong, and that fish caught in those restricted sections often contain strange, foreign objects in their stomachs, buttons, small metal fragments, and occasionally what appear to be tiny human bones. Perhaps the most unsettling phenomenon is a pattern noted by several subsequent historical researchers but never formally studied. In scattered communities across Louisiana, Texas, and as far west as Arizona, there are occasional unverified reports of a woman with eyes that never seem to age. This figure consistently appears in towns experiencing rapid economic growth, typically marrying a financially prominent widower before swiftly disappearing following his untimely death, leaving behind no trace of herself, but a concurrent series of unexplained disappearances among the community's most marginalized and vulnerable residents. The last verified report matching this exact pattern occurred in a small mining town in eastern Arizona in 1958. A wealthy local mine owner married a woman who identified herself as Melanie Beauchamp, claiming to be a transplant from New Orleans. 6 months later, the owner died of an undiagnosed illness. 3 workers from his mine subsequently disappeared and Melanie Beauchamp vanished, leaving behind only a small leather-bound book that was tragically destroyed in a subsequent house fire before local authorities could examine its contents. The Louisiana swamps are deep, and their dark waters are known to keep secrets extremely well. What exactly feeds beneath the silent cypress roots remains unknown, but in certain parishes, parents still issue a stern warning to their children to come home before dusk with a chilling caution. Don't linger near still water at dusk, or the bride of the bayou might take a liking to you. What the recovered documents from 1965 failed to fully explain was the ultimate fate of the 39 enslaved people who vanished from Oak Shadow that fateful October night. Local folklore strongly maintains that they had been the final victims of Melanie's ultimate feeding ritual, their bodies irrevocably disposed of in the deep, unyielding pools of the cypress swamp. However, Professor Whitmore's extensive surviving notes include detailed records of interviews conducted with extremely elderly residents of St. Martin Parish in the early 1960s, which suggest a more complex and terrifying truth. According to these oral accounts, for many years after the Oak Shadow incident, there were sporadic, credible reports from hunters and trappers who claimed to have encountered ghost-like Negroes dwelling deep within the isolated swamplands between St. Martinville and the vast Atchafalaya Basin. These individuals were consistently described as wild-eyed and sometimes speaking in strange, unintelligible tongues, living in highly makeshift camps that could be instantaneously abandoned. They reportedly fled in terror from any white person who came near, disappearing into winding waterways where few would dare to follow. One particularly detailed account came from Etienne Mouton, a Cajun trapper who in 1851 claimed to have stumbled upon a highly secret, hidden settlement approximately 17 miles southwest of the former Oak Shadow Plantation site. In a chilling statement given to a traveling Methodist minister and meticulously preserved in obscure church records, Mouton described finding a tight collection of small huts built high up on stilts above the standing water, connected by narrow plank walkways that could be quickly pulled up and removed. He observed approximately 20 individuals, including women and several small children who appeared to have been born in the years since the Oak Shadow disappearances. Most disturbing in Mouton's account was his description of the community's apparent leader, a tall, rigidly straight-backed woman with skin the deep, dark color of aged cypress wood, whom the others treated with an unsettling mixture of profound deference and palpable fear. When she abruptly noticed Mouton watching from his hidden position, he claimed she turned directly toward him and smiled, a terrifying smile that revealed teeth deliberately filed to sharp points, like those of an alligator. Mouton immediately fled in panic, becoming disoriented and lost in the swamp for 2 full days before finally finding his way back to civilization. When he later led a small party of men back to the exact location, they found only the charred, remnant remains of stilts protruding from the water and a strange, elaborate symbol carved deep into a nearby cypress tree, described as a spiral with small marks like fingers reaching from its center. This account chillingly aligns with an unusual notation found within Meline's personal journal, previously considered indecipherable by Whitmore. On the page dated September 3, 1843, beneath a regular entry, Meline had drawn a very similar spiral symbol and written, "The worthy will not feed the water, but become its voice. The blood gift ensures loyalty beyond death's threshold. Grandmother's promise holds true. Those who drink both waters can never truly leave my side." This cryptic reference suggests that Meline may have been engaging in some specific form of ritualistic control over certain highly chosen individuals from among the enslaved population, those she deemed worthy in her writings. Rather than murdering all who vanished, she may have been intentionally inducing a form of profound psychological dependence through specific drugs or other ritualistic means, effectively creating loyal, terrified followers who would willingly assist in her horrific activities and eventually flee with her into the remote waterways. Further supporting this disturbing theory are records retrieved from the Louisiana State Hospital in Jackson, dated 1872, meticulously documenting the admission of a man found wandering in the depths of the Atchafalaya swamps by passing lumber workers. The man, estimated to be in his 50s and identified only as John, was described as being in a state of extreme physical deterioration, with numerous patterned scarifications covering his body. He spoke very little, but hospital staff noted that he repeatedly made the same profoundly disturbing claim, that he had been bound to the swamp bride by consuming a specific mixture of her blood and water drawn directly from the feeding pool. He claimed he had finally managed to escape after 26 cycles of the moon, when the woman's attention had become entirely focused on meticulously preparing for a new husband. The patient died 3 weeks after his admission from what was formally determined to be advanced tuberculosis. The examining physician's notes indicated that the man's internal organs showed clear signs of prolonged, repeated poisoning, possibly from consistent exposure to toxic substances derived from certain swamp plants known to cause severe hallucinations and intense physical dependency. In 1878, an article appeared in the New Orleans Daily Picayune describing the shocking discovery of what was called a cult encampment in the remote marshlands of Calcasieu Parish, approximately 100 miles west of St. Martinville. Local authorities investigating reports of cattle theft found evidence of recent habitation, including unusual artifacts, crude dolls made of Spanish moss and bone, containers of stagnant water mixed with unidentified substances, and a leather-bound journal containing entries written in a cipher that was never successfully decoded. The most significant connection to the Oak Shadow case came from an elderly woman living near the site who claimed that for several years she had occasionally traded food and supplies with a composed and well-spoken colored woman who would emerge from the swamp every few months. The woman, who never gave her name, always asked detailed questions about wealthy widowers in the region, showing particular interest in their health assets and family connections. She was always accompanied by at least two men who stood silent as statues, their eyes never blinking, with strange markings cut into their arms. The final documented connection to Melline Walker appears in the 1889 Journal of Drive Ellis Montgomery, a physician in Beaumont, Texas. Montgomery recorded treating a woman who identified herself as Melline Bogard, claiming to be the recent widow of a cattle baron from Louisiana. Montgomery noted that despite claiming to be in her 60s, the woman appeared remarkably youthful, with only the faintest lines around her eyes and mouth. She sought treatment for a persistent cough, which Montgomery diagnosed as early consumption. What drew Montgomery's attention, however, was the woman's unusual request for information about local mining operations and their owners. When he inquired about her interest, she explained that she was considering investment opportunities following her husband's death. Montgomery, who had family connections in Louisiana, became suspicious when he noticed a distinctive ring on the woman's finger, a gold band with an unusual pattern that matched the description of a ring known to have belonged to Thomas Hebert, the overseer who had disappeared from Oak Shadow 46 years earlier. In his journal, Montgomery wrote, upon observing the ring and making a casual reference to St. Martin Parish, I noted an immediate change in the woman's demeanor. Though her expression remained pleasant, something in her eyes became calculating, measuring. She inquired as to my family connections in Louisiana with unusual intensity. I fabricated a distant relation rather than revealing my cousin's marriage into the Beauchamp family, whose plantation neighbored the infamous Oak Shadow. As she departed, she paused at the door and said, Doctor, you have the look of a man who would benefit from swamp water tonic. It preserves the constitution remarkably well. The statement was delivered with such knowing menace that I found myself unable to sleep that night. The following morning, I made inquiries about Mrs. Beauregard's residence only to find she had departed town before dawn, leaving no forwarding address. Montgomery's journal entry is the last credible historical record that can be potentially linked to Melline Walker. However, local histories throughout East Texas and western Louisiana contain scattered references to a woman matching her description, appearing periodically in remote communities through the early 1900s, always following a similar pattern. Marriage to a wealthy, usually older man, his subsequent illness and death, unexplained disappearances among local workers or servants, and the woman's eventual departure with a small group of devoted followers. The most intriguing aspect of these accounts is the apparent age of the woman, described consistently as appearing to be in her late 20s or early 30s despite the passing of decades. This impossibility has led most historians to dismiss these as separate incidents involving different women, perhaps even deliberate mimicry of the notorious Bayou bride legend. However, those familiar with the original Oak Shadow documents note the consistency of specific details across accounts separated by both time and distance. Details that were not included in any publicly available records of the case. Professor Whitmore's final notes on the Oak Shadow investigation, dated just 2 weeks before his own death in 1966, contain a troubling personal admission. I have become increasingly convinced that my research has drawn unwanted attention. Twice in the past month, I have observed a woman watching my home from the street, a slender figure who never approaches but stands motionless for hours. Yesterday, my housekeeper reported that while I was at the university, a well-dressed woman, claiming to be a former student, requested access to my study to leave a gift. When refused entry, she left a small package containing a cloth pouch of the type described in the Walker documents, filled with what appears to be soil and water from a swamp. Enclosed with a note reading only, "Curiosity fed the historian to the water. I have decided to conclude my research immediately and have arranged for my notes to be sealed upon my death." Whitmore died 3 days later after a rapid decline that his doctors could not explain. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but the attending physician noted the unusual presentation of symptoms, including darkened veins visible beneath the skin and the persistent odor of stagnant water that seemed to emanate from the patient's pores despite repeated bathing. In 1982, during construction of a pipeline through St. Martin Parish, workers uncovered a collection of human remains approximately half a mile from the former eastern boundary of Oak Shadow Plantation. Archaeological examination determined the remains belonged to at least 7 individuals, all showing signs of sharp force trauma consistent with ritual sacrifice. Carbon dating placed the time of death in the mid-9th century. Most notable was the discovery among the bones of a gold wedding band engraved with the initials HW and the date March 12, 1843, the day Harold Walker married Melline in Charleston. The most recent connection to the Oak Shadow case emerged in 2002 when a historian researching antebellum plantation records discovered a drape in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society. The image dated 1842 and labeled simply Charleston debutante shows a young woman with striking features and the intense gaze described in accounts of Melline Walker. What makes this image particularly disturbing is its provenance. It was donated to the Society in 1971 by a woman named Melline Heber, who claimed to have found it among her grandmother's possessions. Attempts to locate this donor revealed that the address provided was a cemetery in New Orleans Garden District, and the plot number corresponded to a grave that, according to records, had remained empty since its purchase in 1868. The name on the deed for this burial plot, Melline Walker. In the years since Professor Whitmore's investigation, the legend of the Bride of Bayou has persisted in Louisiana folklore, evolving from historical accounts into cautionary tales told to children and eventually into the stuff of campfire stories and local ghost tours. The actual documents relating to Oak Shadow, if they still exist, remain hidden from public view, perhaps deliberately sealed by those who fear what deeper investigation might reveal or what it might attract. What is perhaps most disturbing about the Walker case is not the historical horror it represents, but the possibility that it never truly ended. Every few years, local newspapers in small towns across the American South and Southwest publish brief reports of a similar pattern. A charismatic woman with no verifiable background marries a wealthy widower. Local workers or vulnerable residents begin to disappear. The husband dies of a wasting illness. The widow vanishes with a small group of devoted followers. In 2012, police in a small Arizona mining town investigated the disappearance of 3 migrant workers and the suspicious death of Harold Reinhardt, a 78-year-old mine owner who had 6 months earlier married a woman who called herself Melline Beauchamp. She claimed to be 32, but according to the town sheriff, looked like she hadn't aged a day past 25. By the time authorities connected the pattern to previous incidents, Melline had vanished along with Reinhardt's personal assistant and 2 household staff members. The investigating officer noted in his report that Reinhardt's home had a room that had been converted into what appeared to be some kind of shrine with dozens of small glass bottles containing murky water, soil, and what the forensic lab confirmed were human teeth and bone fragments. Written in what appeared to be dried blood on the wall above this collection was a single phrase: "The water never forgets those who feed it." In the wake of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, as waters receded from flooded sections of St. Martin Parish, local residents reported unusual discoveries in areas that had been submerged for generations. Rotting wooden platforms built on stilts deep within previously inaccessible sections of swampland, strange symbols carved into the trunks of ancient cypress trees, and most disturbing, a series of small islands in the deepest parts of the swamp where the soil was unnaturally dark and nothing would grow. Soil samples taken from one such location by an environmental assessment team revealed abnormally high concentrations of iron consistent with large quantities of blood having saturated the ground over time. The geologist who analyzed these samples noted something else: the presence of a unique organic compound that could not be immediately identified. Further analysis by a university laboratory determined it to be a complex mixture containing elements of human blood, swamp water, and extracts from several plants known for their psychoactive properties, including some that are not native to Louisiana. The compound, when tested on laboratory rats, induced an unusual state of heightened suggestibility, followed by intense dependency on the substance. Animals deprived of it after repeated exposure displayed extreme aggression, self-mutilation, and behavior that the researchers described as ritualistic. The study into the unique swamp compounds was abruptly discontinued after the lead researcher herself began exhibiting a cascade of similar symptoms, allegedly following the accidental ingestion of a minute quantity of the compound. In her final frantic research notes, written just before being committed to psychiatric care, she scrawled, "The water speaks. She is its voice. Those who drink forget everything but her will." Perhaps the single most unsettling facet of the Melline Walker case is the systematic, determined manner in which it appears to have been excised from official history. The documents retrieved in 1962 and meticulously examined by Professor Whitmore prior to their alleged destruction constitute the sole detailed record of the profound horrors that transpired at Oak Shadow Plantation. All other contemporary sources, local newspapers, formal court records, parish registers, contain conspicuous and inexplicable gaps precisely where information regarding these specific events should logically be situated. This systematic erasure suggests not merely the usual historical suppression of profoundly uncomfortable truths, but something far more deliberate, as if those who possessed full knowledge of the events feared that preserving the story might, in some terrifying way, preserve Melline herself, keeping her active in communal memory, if not in literal fact. The paramount question that has tormented researchers for generations is not simply who or what Melline Walker truly was, but whether she represents a finished historical curiosity or an active, enduring threat. The persistent pattern of appearances matching her exact description across a span of nearly 180 years entirely defies rational, conventional explanation. Yet, the disturbing consistency of minute details in cases separated by vast distances and decades suggests something beyond simple copycat crimes or the natural evolution of folklore. In Professor Whitmore's final heavily annotated notes, he proposed a deeply disturbing, yet scientifically plausible theory. What if the elaborate, gruesome rituals Melline performed in the swamp were not merely acts of sadistic murder or the expression of a deeply deranged mind, but were instead part of a process she genuinely believed would grant her dramatically extended life? And what if, more horrifying still, they achieved this effect not through supernatural intervention, but through some horrific, calculated combination of natural compounds found within the unique ecosystem of the Louisiana swamps, combined with fresh human biological material in specific, ritualistic proportions? What if she successfully discovered, either through her grandmother's cryptic teachings or her own meticulous experimentation, a powerful substance capable of dramatically slowing human cellular deterioration, a process sustained only at the cost of regular feedings of fresh human tissue? This terrifying hypothesis would provide a rational, albeit macabre, explanation for her apparent agelessness, her nomadic pattern of movements, the disappearances that consistently surround her, and her specific preference for wealthy husbands who could furnish both essential social cover and the considerable financial means required to continue her ongoing, secret work. This theory, while initially appearing utterly fantastic, finds chilling and unexpected support in modern scientific research. In 2018, a dedicated research team studying extremophile bacteria unique to the Louisiana swamps discovered microorganisms that naturally produce organic compounds exhibiting remarkable cellular preservation properties. When applied to human tissue samples in controlled laboratory settings, these specific compounds dramatically slowed deterioration rates and even showed potential for preserving some neural function. The researchers noted in their internal findings that similar bacteria, when deliberately combined with certain rare plant extracts found primarily along the Gulf Coast region, could potentially create substances capable of even more profound and dramatic effects. Their subsequent paper, published in a respected scientific journal, made absolutely no reference to the Melline Walker case or Professor Whitmore's specific historical theories. However, one of the paper's lead researchers was subsequently found to have meticulously downloaded all available information regarding the Oak Shadow case from university archives shortly before commencing the study. 3 months after the paper's highly publicized publication, this researcher abruptly resigned her position and vanished. Her current whereabouts remain entirely unknown. Local law enforcement agencies throughout Louisiana and neighboring states maintain no official, publicly available files on the bride of Bayou or Melline Walker. When formally questioned, representatives typically dismiss the entire narrative as mere folk legend or sensationalized urban myth. Nevertheless, veteran officers in certain parishes are known to quietly and unofficially track cases that precisely fit the long-established pattern, maintaining unofficial records and occasionally issuing discreet warnings to colleagues in other jurisdictions when similar, unexplained incidents begin to unfold. One such officer, who requested complete anonymity, stated in a 2019 interview, "We don't discuss it officially, but every few years, something happens that just fits the description. A woman appears from nowhere, marries into money. People start to vanish. By the time anyone manages to connect the scattered dots, she's long gone. Different name each time, but always some variation of Melline. Always that exact same pattern of disappearances. Always that same description. Young-looking, intense eyes, a way of speaking that somehow compels people to do what she wants." We've even started to notice a clear geographic pattern. She moves along the natural waterways, never staying more than a year in one place, always heading west for a period, then invariably circling back toward Louisiana, like she needs to come home to the original swamp, like she's feeding something there that sustains her. In October of 2021, a real estate developer acquired a vast tract of land in St. Martin Parish, which included the area corresponding to the former eastern boundary of Oak Shadow Plantation. During the preliminary environmental assessment, workers discovered a series of complex underwater structures in the remote swamp area that appeared to be the deteriorated remains of wooden platforms, strikingly similar to those described in Etienne Mouton's harrowing 1851 account. Further investigation revealed a small, raised island deep within the cypress stand that contained what archaeologists ultimately identified as a ritual site dating back to the mid-19th century. Most significant of all was the discovery of a sealed metal container meticulously buried beneath a massive cypress tree at the center of this island. Inside lay another leather-bound journal with a chilling note affixed directly to its cover. The note, dated October 15, 1843, the precise day of Melline's original disappearance from Oak Shadow, read, "To whoever finds this record, I leave it knowing that none will believe what is written here, yet feeling compelled to provide some warning to those who might follow. What began in Haiti with my grandmother's learning and continued through my work in these waters creates something that cannot be undone. The feeding must continue, and I must return to this place periodically to renew what sustains me. Those who drink the mixture become mine beyond death's reach. Those whose essence feeds the water become part of what empowers it. I have selected my worthy ones from among the enslaved, and we depart tonight for new territories. But I will return to these waters when necessary, as I must. The cycle continues as long as I do, and I have now taken enough to last many lifetimes. Judge me not by the morality of ordinary existence. I transcended those limitations with my first feeding." The journal itself reportedly contained detailed, meticulous instructions for creating what Melline termed the water of extension, a complex, specific process involving human blood, highly specific swamp bacteria, precise plant extracts, and ritualistic timing. Before archaeologists could fully document these contents, the container and journal vanished without a trace from the secured university laboratory where they were undergoing study. The graduate student who had been assigned the task of transcribing the text vanished the same night, along with all digital copies of material. 3 months later, police in East Texas investigated the disappearance of 3 immigrant workers from a small town near the Louisiana border. They had last been definitively seen in the company of a well-dressed young woman who had recently arrived in the area, claiming to be researching local history for a university project. According to eyewitnesses, the woman had been particularly interested in properties with accessible natural water sources and had spent a considerable amount of time discreetly asking detailed questions about wealthy, elderly residents in the region. The investigation remains officially open. The woman has never been identified. Perhaps the most profoundly disturbing of all the theories surrounding the bride of Bayou is the possibility that Melanie Walker was not a singular entity, that she methodically passed her specialized, horrific knowledge and techniques to selected followers over the decades, successfully establishing a lineage of brides who continue her precise practices into the present day. This theory would elegantly account for the biological impossibility of a single woman appearing visually unchanged across nearly 2 centuries, while still explaining the absolute consistency of the methods and patterns documented in cases. If this theory holds true, then the horror of Oak Shadow Plantation never truly ceased. It simply transformed, chillingly adapting to changing times while tenaciously maintaining its essential, terrifying nature. The systematic sacrifice of human life to sustain something that should not exist. The swamps of Louisiana are ancient and deep. Their waters conceal secrets that modern science is only beginning to comprehend. In remote, secluded areas where cypress trees have stood for centuries, locals still report hearing strange, unnatural sounds at night. These sounds are sometimes described as singing, sometimes as crying, and sometimes as the clear voice of a woman calling out names in the darkness. Fishermen occasionally discover unusual objects hopelessly tangled in their lines when they venture too deep into certain backwaters. Buttons, small pieces of jewelry, and once even a gold wedding band engraved with the initials HW in St. Martin Parish. There remains a specific section of Bayou that local guides absolutely refuse to enter, even in broad daylight. They will not explain their refusal beyond vague, fearful references to bad water, or the place where she fed. Maps of the area reveal nothing ostensibly unusual, but satellite imagery reveals a subtle anomaly. A near-perfect circle of unnaturally darker vegetation, approximately half an acre in diameter, centered precisely on what appears to be a small island. One environmental researcher described finding cellular material within the circle that does not correspond to any known plant or animal species indigenous to the region, almost as if the water itself had developed a bizarre, unique biological signature. Perhaps most telling of all is a local custom, still meticulously observed in certain deep parishes, of placing small offerings, usually food or flowers, but sometimes personal items like hairbrushes or articles of clothing, at the immediate edge of swamplands every October 15th, the documented anniversary of Melanie's disappearance from Oak Shadow. Environmental scientists who have analyzed water samples from this exact location note unusual chemical compositions and unexplained organic compounds that do not align with typical swamp ecology. When asked about this strange, enduring practice, elderly residents simply and quietly reply that it is to keep her fed and away from our doors. The true legacy of Melanie Walker may never be fully deciphered. Historical records remain frustratingly fragmented. Deliberate obfuscation obscures the facts, and those few who investigate too deeply often find themselves professionally abandoned by colleagues who fear association with folklore rather than serious academic history. Yet the chilling pattern persists, reappearing with disturbing regularity across vast distances and time. A young woman with unnerving eyes, a wealthy husband who quickly wastes away, disappearances that are never explained, and always, a deep proximity to water. For those few who have studied the case most thoroughly, one question remains absolutely paramount. If Melanie or her possible successors still exist, still meticulously practicing the dark techniques described in those recovered documents, Who feeds the water now? And what exactly does it feed in return? In certain remote parishes of Louisiana, parents still strictly caution their children to stay well away from the water's edge as darkness begins to fall. They warn them not to stop and listen if they hear a woman singing in the twilight, and never under any circumstances to drink from still water in the swamp, no matter how clear and inviting it might deceptively appear. They recount the entire story of the bride of Bayou, not as a mere legend or an entertaining campfire tale, but as living history, a tangible danger that has never truly passed. And inherent in their retelling is the unspoken, primal fear that somewhere, hidden deep in the darkness of the cypress swamp, Meline Walker still waits, her insatiable hunger undiminished by the passing of time, the water ever ready to receive her gruesome offerings.